All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We're celebrating National Infertility Awareness Week, and today's event is about the LGBTQ plus journeys to parenthood. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so if you have any questions during this webinar, feel free to start dropping them in the chat so our doctors can help answer at the end. Our panelists for today are Dr. Jasmine Pedroso, Dr. Mackenzie Purdy, Langley and Laura, and David. Dr. Pedroso, do you want to start us off?
Sure, absolutely. I just wanted to say thank you again all for joining us this afternoon/evening. So happy to see so many of you on this Zoom call. My name is Dr. Jasmine Pedroso. I am an OBGYN and I specialize in minimally invasive pelvic surgery based out of San Francisco. I have the pleasure of introducing two of our panelists today, Langley McNeil and Laura Stokes-Green. They'll be joined by their son, Julian, and they were generous enough to share their family building stories with us today.
Hi, everybody. I want to introduce myself, Mackenzie Purdy. I'm one of the reproductive endocrinologists. I'm in the St. Louis location, previously with Vios, but now that Vios has merged, we would basically all just be called Kindbody at this point. But I have the pleasure of being able to introduce David Clark-Sally, who was a patient of ours back when I think we were just Vios then. And certainly really happy to be a part of this panel tonight and talk about something that is, very important. And the goal of this week altogether for the National Infertility Awareness Week is to get a lot of, the message out there and for all of us to be advocates for advancing the fertility care for everybody. And we know that comes in a lot of ways. It comes in importance in legislature and for ability for people to get better coverage and then just better access to knowledge and how to navigate these scenarios. So I'm really looking forward to hearing, both of the stories tonight. And then being able to talk through a little bit more about the logistics about anyone that's going down this path and has questions, and we'll be able to hopefully answer all those at the end of the talk. So look forward to that.
My name's Langley. I was a professional skier in my past life. Gotta travel the world and race on the World Cup circuit and the X Games. And now I run community for an events company called Summit Series.
I'm Dr. Laura Stokes-Green. I'm a veterinarian for horses and I specialize in sports medicine. And when Lang and I met, there was this immediate magic over peak performance and athletes. And it was really cool to have that on the ski side. And then I was explaining to her all about the horse side. And even when I got really big and pregnant and couldn't do the things anymore, Lang actually came and helped me and was my vet tech and was taking x-rays and helping me with the horses.
Her job is very intense.
Oh my gosh.
My name is David Clark-Sally. I live in Madison, Wisconsin with my husband, Matt, who is actually traveling this week. And so he's not with me, but we had our daughter, Ellie, about 6 months and some change ago with the help of the team at Vios. We also have two older girls from my husband's first marriage who are 9 and 11. And we are just big fans of the Vios team. I'm even representing tonight. Yeah, I'm just honored to be here to speak a little bit about this topic. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. We appreciate you for being here.
So who are we? Like we mentioned before, we're a company called Kindbody, and we're on a mission to make reproductive health and fertility care more accessible to everybody. And that, of course, includes our LGBTQ family. We serve patients directly, but we also provide a benefit to employers that includes not just fertility, but gynecology and wellness as well. And we had such an honor, just merging with this amazing company called Vios, who's been around for a while. So Vios Fertility Institute, we merged with to basically expand access to fertility care even faster. So we overnight, we doubled the size of the company and access to care for fertility services across the US overnight. And we still have all the same locations, the same providers, the same innovative treatments. We're just so excited to have joined forces to do more for everyone in this country. So what do we do? It's kind of what do we not do? So something that really distinguishes Kindbody from other fertility or traditional fertility centers is that, yes, we do fertility. We do the fertility assessments, virtual consultations, egg freezing, embryo banking, IVF, insemination. We use donor eggs, donor sperm, all those things. We also do at-home fertility tests. But something that's super unique is it's not just fertility. It's also the gynecology and all the gynecological life issues surrounding fertility. So if you have chronic pelvic pain, if you have PCOS, if you have abnormal PAPs, if you have fibroids, if you just want some birth control for now because you're not ready to get pregnant, and all the wellness issues surrounding it. So we have nutritionists that you can see virtually, acupressure, therapists, counselors for donor and surrogacy services. So super, super happy and proud to be working for such a progressive company. And so even if you're not thinking about fertility, we're happy to help you through contraception journeys, that kind of thing as well. So we'll go to next slide. Again, Kindbody plus Vios, we're on a mission. We think that fertility care and reproductive care is essential. We believe that one of the most important things that impacts fertility is actually time. So because of that, access to care is so, so important. And so it's imperative to provide this kind of access. And again, with Vios, we have doubled in size, and now we're able to provide services to a wider group of folks. But what's also equally important is creating a welcoming and inclusive experience for everybody. And with that being said, making sure that these journeys that we go through are realistic, talked about. We want to change the conversation from focusing on infertility to focusing on actual fertility and family building, and just destigmatizing this entire journey that folks don't talk about. So with that being said, I would love for Langley and Laura to share their journey to having Julian. And if you want to take the lead there.
Yeah, absolutely. So Langley and I met in 2018, and I was, how old? Let's see, I'm 41 now. So I met Langley and immediately knew this is my person. It was the first person I had met where I had really thought, okay, this is someone that I want to have a family with. And I think there are three things that I think of when I think of how do you create that family. One is in a same-sex partnership, what does actually goes into that and the process and the procedure. And then two things that apply to same-sex and then to everyone else is one, age, which to your point about time, we all know that as we get older, it gets harder and harder to conceive. And then also we had both really put our careers first and had very robust careers, and that ties into the whole time and process. And so we started down this journey. We were so excited and immediately hit some pretty intense sort of roadblocks or questions. And so I had frozen my eggs when I was 36. And during the pandemic, I had actually sent my eggs to a different lab, not Kindbody. And unfortunately, all of those eggs, when we tried to make them into embryos, didn't make it. So we were faced with a really intense, very challenging decision of what to do at that point. And so Lang and I decided at that point, okay, we're going to go for another actual embryo creation cycle. And so I did another egg retrieval cycle, and that's where we made the embryos that created baby Julian here. And then before that too was the question of, okay, well, in the process of how we're going to make a baby in a same-sex relationship, where does the sperm come from, and who's going to be the donor or the person that comes into our life with that? And we had talked about it very early on and had a very good friend in our life who was just involved enough with us and just removed enough from us that it was the perfect known donor situation. And this is a really specific situation to us. I know everyone has an opinion on known or unknown donors. We really talked a lot about that, agreed on it immediately between the two of us. So then the process was, okay, well, how do we ask him? And Mikey, do you want to speak a little bit about that and also about the legal and all of that stuff?
Yeah, I think the most challenging thing about being gay is you can't create a baby with the person you love. Right? And so, I build community for a living, and I'm very relationship based. And so, a known donor felt very exciting to me because I wanted to know who the donor was and be able to look him in the eyes and see who he was as an adult. And Laura met him as well, and I've known him for about a decade, and we've worked together. So I've seen him in stressful environments. I've seen him with people. I've seen him with children. I've met his family. He's spent Christmas with ours. And the second Laura met him, I actually didn't say anything because I didn't want to, have this cherished outcome and then not have her agree. And we actually were on a vacation together down in the Dominican Republic, and he was throwing these kids that were on the trip up in the air in the pool, and she looks at me and she's like, oh my God. And he's beautiful. He was a professional water polo player, and he's very statuesque, but I love his kindness and his generosity of spirit more than anything. And Laura looked at me and she's like, oh my gosh, he would make the most amazing donor. And so we spent a bunch of time together, and then we formally asked him, and he cried. And
which was terrifying.
It was terrifying. Like, we had talked about it, 5 years previous, kind of joking around. And he's like, if you're in love and I love her, I would be honored to help you create a family. And so when we formally asked him, though, you're like, is he serious about this? And there's so many hoops he had to jump through for us, right? Especially during COVID. He had to get COVID tested, and we all had to genetically screen against each other. That's one thing with a known donor that I didn't know, right? If you go through a sperm bank, they've already done a lot of the processing. So you get really excited about this idea, but then, so I had to genetically screen with him to make sure we weren't both carrying recessive genes. So, I passed with him, and you're sitting by the phone to make sure. And then Laura had to pass with him. So it was a lot of breath holding. We were thrilled when months and months and months of tests, and, just very attached to the outcome. So relieved that when it came back clear. And then, he couldn't go in the hot tub for this time. He couldn't use car seat heaters, no laptops on the lap. And he took it really seriously. He changed his nutrition and really trained for us, which I thought was just adorable. And then
there's also the legal aspect of it,
yes.
Right? And this is a question that we get from a lot of people. Well, how do you feel about having someone that in your life being the genetic parent or genetic father of this child? And that's where we wanted to get really clear on the parenting responsibilities. And so we got him a lawyer, we got ourselves a lawyer, we wrote everything out, really the two of us fleshed it over quite a bit to make sure that we were on line with what we wanted. And then when we presented it to him, he had told us basically, I'll sign whatever you want, but you never know, really. You never know how someone's going to act when they're donating. You never know how someone's going to act when the baby actually arrives. And so that was really of, I think, our baby creation, to know for sure that our rights were going to be protected. And so what we did was we created legal documents where Julian, we are the parents, obviously, of Julian, and he has absolutely no legal right whatsoever. Our personal opinion is we do want to let Julian know that this person was the gift that gave us the ability to have Julian. And, we're going to take what that means step by step, because surely it's different than a lot of the ways that children come into the world. But we've been so thrilled with how this person has respected our decision process and really been so wonderful and lovely through the whole thing. So that was sort of the how the genetic material came to be.
And I want to say one thing real quick.
Please.
With same-sex marriage being legal now, it's great. If you're married at the time the baby is born, if your names are both on the birth certificate, you are the legal parents, which is phenomenal for LGBT rights. But, we live in a crazy society, and with Roe versus Wade being under attack, God forbid same-sex marriage ever does. We also took the precautions, and I legally adopted Julian last month, which was great. And Laura will do the same when I carry the next one. So it's always just good to think through the what ifs. It's a lot of intentional planning, but we wanted to be really, really foolproof.
So then in the process of creating those embryos, now I am, doing the second cycle in the hospital. Kindbody was absolutely incredible every step of the way, really guiding us. We had the WhatsApp group for our communication, everything from prescriptions to shots to logistics, which we have a lot of logistics in our life because my practice for horses is between multiple locations. They've just been phenomenal the whole way. And one thing that was very surprising to me is we chose to do the genetic testing of the embryos because of my advanced age. Advanced, I feel like a kid, but 41 advanced age. So we wanted to know that the embryo that we were going to be transplanting was healthy, as healthy as possible. And that was a real surprise to me because of the number of embryos that were viable on day 5 of the creation. The vast majority of them were genetically abnormal by a lot. And so we were then at the end had a very few number of embryos that were genetic normals. And thank God the first one was Julian. But even that process, this is something that I think is so important to highlight, is the ups and the downs of the whole thing. And that you really, if you can embrace that process, it's just such a process, but you will get there eventually. And so we tried a couple of different ways to prepare the uterine lining for the transfer. The first 2 didn't take the way that we had hoped. And then on the third one, everything looked great. And that was when we made the transfer of Julian. And then do you want to speak also about your embryos and
Yeah. So we have a friend that used to be the CMO at Kindbody, Rebecca Silver, who we love. And we also have a friend on the board. And when we were starting to look into NYU or Cornell, they both were like, you should check out Kindbody. They're the new kid on the block. They're like the Apple Store experience. They're making their offices beautiful, and they are like the highest level concierge at a much lower price. And I was like, wow, that sounds too good to be true. But of course, I respected the 2 of them so much that I went in for an appointment, and I was blown away by just the warmth. I think it can be a very intimidating thing because I had no idea, I hadn't thought a lot about my own fertility, especially when I was a pro athlete. I was just very in the moment and goal oriented. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I need to start thinking about this. And so you go in and they really make you feel like there's just no stupid questions.
Yeah.
Laura's a doctor. She's much better at talking about the process
but
than I
was
am.
Also blown away by the patient communication, the bedside manner. It was unlike anything I had experienced.
Yes. So I knew, being in a same-sex marriage that I would do IVF as well. So I wanted to capture my younger eggs. And so I did 2 rounds of IVF to create, I believe we have 4 genetically tested embryos waiting on ice. So as soon as it's go time, I will be returning to Kindbody to create baby number 2.
Yeah. So that's our story, and we're looking forward to hearing everything from everyone and answering any questions. And it's been an incredible journey, and this little one is such a gift. And a ham, he loves this stuff.
Such a good story. Thank you so much, Langley and Laura, for coming. Oh, and it looks like David. Yay, Ellie's on here too. But yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for talking through your story. You hit on so many things that I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about, or probably why they joined in on this, panel discussion to say, okay, what are the legal aspects that go along with LGBTQ family building? What are the things related to, you hit on advanced maternal age and talking about the viability of eggs and how that plays a really big role going through what your journey was. And, sounds like you guys, so wonderful you had each other to support one another during this, because the ups and downs, are a lot to go through. But that is just amazing that, your guys' path, and we're certainly so happy that you're here and that you've got, him. So definitely, I'm assuming people are gonna have questions at the end, and it sounds like you guys are certainly just so knowledgeable, and you've been such good advocates for your care, which is, I think, one of the things that's special about Kindbody, because we welcome that. It's so wonderful for patients that come in, they, I would love to have everyone be a good advocate for your care, because for me, you're not questioning what I'm doing. You're just making sure that everything is done specifically and done well for you. And I think any physician or provider that ever worries about a patient being an advocate for themselves is not doing it right. So I think it's wonderful that you guys have taken such a strong interest in care into your journey, because that's what's going to help you and make sure that your care is the best that it can be. So just appreciate you guys so much. And then we'll definitely hear back from you guys for the questions, okay? So I want to introduce David, and so excited that Ellie made an appearance. And we want to hear about, your guys' story and kind of what you guys went through. And we've got Ellie here, which we already talked about, is 6 months now. So take us back, I think, for this journey and give us some info on how everything went.
Yeah, for sure. I'm very fortunate that my mom is in town this week. So she was with my mom, and she was eating with me, Ma, and then I thought she'd make a little appearance and then maybe go back. So yeah. So we are so grateful for our experience with Vios. But, I think the thing people don't, always talk about, because you see this like beautiful, amazing thing at the end, and you're like, nothing else matters at that point, right? But I mean, it's hard. It's really hard. And so we started, when I met my husband, as I alluded to earlier, he already had 2 children. And so I was an instant dad immediately, which is kind of the only thing that I ever really wanted to do, is to be a parent. And so, we kind of leaned into that for a little bit, and what that looked like, and trying to blend families. But it became very apparent fairly quickly that like this was something that we wanted to do together as well, which I think doesn't detract or take away from her older sisters and how special they are on our family. But there's something to be said for experiencing this with your partner, right? I think, y'all were sort of mentioning that as well. So we started kind of looking into it. My husband is quite an amazing researcher, project manager, detail-oriented type of person, thank God, because while I really enjoy details, I get very overwhelmed very easily when it comes to those sorts of things. Just a lot of anxiety. So he really sort of managed the whole process and started doing all the research and looking into things. Yeah. We started, we kind of had a rough start. We had sort of a couple of false starts with finding a gestational carrier, which was really taxing emotionally. Again, I feel like there's so many parts of parenting that you can't prepare for, right? You could read all the books and people could give you all the advice, but the pre sort of the before part, especially as same-sex couples, that is also not something that you can prepare for. I mean, just the disappointments and the setbacks and sometimes the delays are really, really hard. So we were at a point, or I was at a point emotionally where I was kind of like, I really had felt like I'd kind of hit my cap, and I was like, I don't know that I can keep, like, I need to take a beat. But fortunately, my husband, Matt, who I think this is one of the reasons why we work so well together, was not feeling that way, and was very much ready to forge ahead, and kind of just said, okay, respect that, but are you cool if I don't? And I was like, absolutely. So he started doing, just kind of went harder in terms of trying to find someone to carry for us. We had already gone through the process of working with a local agency to determine what our donor egg situation would look like. We actually went with an anonymous donor. And I don't know that was a thing that we really were like, oh, it has to be someone we don't know versus someone that we do know. It's just kind of the path that we ended up taking. That process was also very overwhelming. When you're presented with sort of a digital database of humans who are all probably equally amazing and clearly vetted and qualified. But then you basically now know everything about them, other than their name. Like when they had practically down to when they had a hangnail last. And so all of a sudden now you're supposed to make a decision. Like it was a lot, right? And then even with that process, there were times where we would, we were interested in someone, but then by the time we sort of expressed our interest, they were already committed to somebody else, you know, and so there was just a lot of back and forth with that as well. And to no fault of anyone, I think that, again, that's just sort of part of the process. So we actually came to Vios a little later in our process because we were working with a local agency. But then I'm sort of interspersing stories here, but then in the midst of all of that, we found the most amazing GC in the world, who happened to live in an area that wasn't ours, right? So she was also located in the Midwest, but not close to us. And so we started to think, you know, that's going to be really inconvenient for her and a lot of extra money for us to have her come here. So maybe we need to pivot a bit. And so we ended up finding Vios, which couldn't have, you know, been better. Really, truly, like it was one of those things that was just like meant to be across the board, right? But because we found her, and because of where she lived, we ended up deciding to sort of pivot to a clinic that had options that were closer to her. And with Vios having, you know, so many different clinics, that we were able to make that work in a way where it was just so much more convenient for her, for all of her appointments, but then also just as a result, then, you know, you're always in the back of your mind still too, right? Thinking about costs. I mean, it's so costly, right? And so that also saved us a bit of money in travel expenses and whatnot. So it was really the best of both worlds. And just to go back a little bit, we found our GC, actually, we sort of took an independent route. We had worked with some agencies and it was just, again, costs were just astronomical, right? And we didn't really know anybody that we really, you know, was able to do it. I think one of the things we learned in this process was not just anyone with a uterus can be a surrogate. We did not know that. And it makes sense now, but we didn't know that, right? So there are a lot of, you know, qualifications, a lot of boxes you have to check, right? And so we found that out very quickly and realized it wasn't just easy to sort of find somebody. So we ended up joining some Facebook groups, and it really was a lot of, again, kudos to my husband, it was a lot of research on his part, but ended up finding, I mean, it couldn't have been, like, it was literally one of those things. It was like, it was meant to be, like an angel on earth who carried our baby for us and has now become a dear friend of ours, which is what we had hoped for, right? Like, best case scenario for us anyways was to find somebody that we liked, as well as who is physically qualified to carry our child. And we did. And so, you know, not to oversimplify, but in the efforts to sort of expedite the story a little bit, once we found her, I felt like things started to fall into place. And we found her and we found Vios. Everything started to fall into place. We got very fortunate that our first transfer took, and we didn't have to do it again. I know so many people are not that fortunate, and so we were just so lucky. We had such a healthy first pregnancy, and everything was great. And the delivery, I mean, even just with the COVID of it all, right? Like, we didn't know were we even going to get to be there, and you know, and we were so fortunate that we were able to be in the room, and we were able to actually, you know, stay at the hospital and had a room of our own with Ellie, and just so fortunate to be able to be there for all of those big moments, right? So yeah, I know I've left out a lot of things, but I also don't want to take too long to finish with this story here. So I'll kind of wrap there, and hopefully if anybody has any questions or if there are other things that come up later, I can sort of clarify a bit more. But I'm just so grateful every day for the team at Vios. Our doctor, Amber Cooper, who, you know, it was not able to be here tonight, and we're so lucky to have Dr. Purdy here, but she is was so incredible to us, just so incredible. And the RN that we worked with at Vios, her name is Julia Hoven, just to give her a shout out, truly has become a dear friend. She has gone above and beyond, and I will sing their praises forever, just because they made this they made like one of the hardest things the most amazing thing for us. So not just in giving us, you know, this, but also just the process, right? Because the process is hard, and we're just so grateful. So yeah.
Thank you so much, David, Langley, and Laura, for sharing your stories. These just warm my heart so much. It's hard not to cry, because we are with you throughout that journey. And every step of the way. And that is something that gives us so much joy to not just see the outcome, but really see the relationships grow through these ups and downs. And, as you can tell, the path to parenthood is very, very, it's like a roller coaster, ups and downs. It is not always linear. There are so many moments where folks can really start to give up a little bit. These paths to parenthood are so difficult, and a lot of times people feel very alone. But we're, again, here to support you all along the way, and hopefully some of these stories will resonate with you, to just kind of go through the basics here. When thinking about your own journey to parenthood, simplifying it just from the very beginning, we need 3 ingredients to make a baby. We need some sperm. So think about where you're going to get that sperm. Is that a known donor, meaning someone you have a relationship with, or someone that that you've approached, whose name who's maybe willing to donate their sperm to you? Or is it an anonymous sperm donor? So this term anonymous sperm donor, anonymous egg donor, actually when you go to sperm donor agencies, it's not just like any guy off the street can donate their sperm like a blood bank. A sperm bank is not like a blood bank. These guys are recruited in, tested for all the infectious diseases. They're tested for their genetic issues, family history. Sometimes you can even see childhood photos, adult photos. There's so much information that you can actually garner from kind of diving into their charts. And the same thing goes with eggs. The second ingredient, we need some eggs. Where are we going to get these eggs? If it's a known donor for those eggs, then that means that your donor is actually going to be injecting themselves with hormones, and for 2 weeks to get their eggs to maturity. We harvest those eggs and then use those eggs to make the embryo. So the third ingredient, again, to simplify everything, once we make this embryo, once we put the sperm and the egg together, make that embryo, where do we put this embryo? Whose uterus do we use? Do we use your uterus? Do we use your partner's uterus? Do we use a gestational carrier or surrogate? So those are basic building blocks for making the families that we see today. So how do we go about finding our path to parenthood? The first step, if we go to the next slide, would just to talk about your situation, what your ideal family looks like. How many children do you want? When do you want to start this journey? Where do you think your source of sperm is going to come from? Where do you think your source of eggs is going to come from? Whose uterus would we anticipate using? And then during that consultation and laying everything out, we can do ovarian reserve testing. We can do ultrasounds. We can do your genetic testing. We can test the sperm. We can test the uterus. And we can also talk through how we choose donor eggs, donor sperm, and find surrogates. And all of this we can do at Kindbody.
So, we're kind of generalizing a lot of things here, but the most important thing is that these steps are all very individualized in regards to what your relationships are, what your family building plan is. So this is going to have a wide scope. We think about someone who wants to be a single mom, single dad by choice. We think about someone who's coming in, knows they have a sperm source, but needing to have an egg source and needing to find a gestational carrier. And then we think about someone who maybe already has a plan for what egg source they're going to use in a uterus, but needs a sperm source. So it's going to be so individualized based on what your family needs are. And so we're breaking this up into a little bit more of the specifics in regards to assessing the egg supply. So for someone who is coming in, knows for their family, they're planning to use either their own eggs or their partner's eggs. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do an ovarian reserve assessment. And I think it was Laura, or might have been Langley, that hit a little bit on this aspect that was a big part of their journey, which is knowing that we're born with all the eggs that we're going to have. As time goes on, this egg supply goes down. And so we have the ability to kind of do a snapshot and gauge what our egg supply is. And that is a good predictor then of someone who's undergoing IVF to see how many eggs they're going to get out. And it gives us just more insight into the overall quantity. The hard part is we're just not smart enough at this point to be able to gauge quality, but we do know that quality of eggs very closely matches your age. So looking at, what are the tests that we would do? So if someone wants to have a gauge on their egg supply, we usually do a hormone test called an anti-Mullerian hormone. Normal level is going to vary based on your age, but a lot of times we see this level anywhere between like 2 to 3 for someone who's in their 30s. Well, someone in their 40s, it's probably going to be closer to be 1 to be normal or even lower. So this is a really helpful tool for us to get an understanding of what does the egg supply look like. And also in regards to looking at an ultrasound where we can look at the ovaries, count the number of follicles that are growing, gives us insight into underlying egg supply. And then the likelihood if someone's undergoing an IVF cycle, how many eggs we think we would be able to retrieve. So this is important to understand, not just from the patient side, if you're planning to use your eggs, but from someone selecting a donor. So if you're going through and you're selecting, let's say, a known donor, or you're using an anonymous donor, these patients have also gone through this screening. So for someone typically to be an anonymous donor, they typically have to have a threshold for their AMH level. They have to have a threshold for their antral follicle count, because certainly we want to have someone that, and I think David talked about this really well, that it's so much to go through to be able to select a donor, but at least one of the good benefits is that a lot of these patients in regards to the selection is, you're making the decisions a lot based on your family and the qualities that you see. And a lot of the things that the physicians and the, providers are trying to take away from that is to make sure they're a good candidate from you from a medical standpoint. So these are just really important tools for us to be able to understand this process a little bit more. Okay, next slide. So we already talked about the standpoint that quantity is a big aspect and something that we can gauge pretty well in regards to using these tools, these hormone evaluations and these ultrasounds. We're just not very smart yet, and we don't have enough knowledge to be able to assess quality, but we can look at the data we have and say, okay, well, we know, and I think Laura, I think you were the one that hit on this, that it was very surprising when you had the embryo report come back that out of the number of embryos you had biopsied, the rate of euploid was lower. And it's so frustrating. You're healthy, you're obviously in really good shape, and you're doing all these things to make sure your health is good. And then you test these embryos and they come back and a large portion are aneuploid, meaning chromosomally abnormal. And it's just not fair. But it's important to recognize. And I think you guys were really good advocates for yourself. Like you said, that you tried to freeze at a younger age. You were really proactive, recognizing that age plays a really big role here. So I think the important takeaway is for someone that is wanting to kind of move down this journey, age does play a role, and it has a bigger role more from the maternal side than the paternal side. Men make new sperm every 80 days, so we can see longevity more so from a sperm quality and quantity. But from a maternal side, it's very important to be proactive, recognizing that not just the quantity goes down, but also the quality. So you guys are such good advocates for that because you have knowledge and understand that. So I think it's so great that you shared about that and hit on that important aspect that was, very specific for your journey too. So, okay, next slide. So we're talking about individualizing the care, and we talked a little bit about assessing egg health, depending on, if that makes sense for your family, if you have a known egg source. And we talked about how that can be important when someone's selecting a donor that has already been screened for. But the same rules apply from a sperm source. So if someone's coming in knowing they're planning to use their sperm or their partner's sperm, we're going to do a semen analysis because we want to make sure that there's good sperm that's available. If the counts are extremely low, we know that there may be a decrease in fertilization, or it may limit the tools we have to help with the pregnancy. And I think Dr. Pedroso is going to talk a little bit more about this, but the options of, do you do something like Iui, depending on if that fits for your family, where you take sperm, put that into the uterus, if you know that you're using your uterus or your egg. That availability may not be there if the sperm numbers are low. And then in that case, a lot of times we have to guide someone to go forward and do IVF. So having a semen analysis is very important from the beginning, but it also relates to the fact that if you're using a known donor, which I'm sure this happened for Laura and Langley, they did a semen analysis of their known donor to say, okay, well, if these counts are close to zero, someone's going to be realistic and say, gosh, the likelihood of them being a good donor, it may not be in the cards, right? It was the genetic carrier screening, it was the semen analysis, it was the infectious disease, and we do all these things because we want to make sure that the success is going to be as high as it can. So that's kind of what we're looking for in regards to the semen analysis. Okay, next slide. And then for third-party reproduction, which is basically what we're talking about through all of these different tests and what we've really been talking about this whole time in regards to LGBTQ plus family building. So at Kindbody and most reproductive centers across the United States, there's typically a third-party program that's in place. And this is addressing the need for using donor gametes, so like donor sperm, donor egg, or a gestational carrier. And these programs are really important because I think, David, you hit on this, the ups and downs of going through this process, starts, the stops, and you need someone who's going to be an advocate for you to make sure that you wrangle all of these pieces. Okay, who's following up with the gestational care agency? Who's making sure that the sperm is shipped to the company? Who's making sure that the eggs are being shipped in? And if you don't have that third-party team that's being an advocate for you, it's going to just make that process even longer. So that's certainly I think, a very beneficial thing about Kindbody. And I think that is a big attribute of a lot of the reproductive companies across the United States, recognizing the importance of third party and recognizing that it's not just these pieces that have to come together, it's the emotional part too, because I can't imagine the amount of starts and stops that you guys had and the turmoil you had to deal with along the way. And so I'm just hopeful that, as physicians or providers, that we're kind of reaching out and recognizing that this is a roller coaster and we want to make it as smooth as we can. And we know we can only do so much, but having this team in place and having, a champion in your provider is probably one of the most important things in a company or in a clinic that you're seeing. All right, next slide. So Dr. Pedroso talked a little bit about this in selecting a donor. So we said this is individualized based on what your family building needs are. So for someone's coming in saying, okay, well, I don't have a sperm source, I need to talk through the benefits of either using a known donor versus an anonymous donor. And then same thing from a family building perspective, if someone knows they need to use an egg donor. So, when I talk to my patients about this, I go through the pluses and minuses. And, Laura Langley, you guys basically took a lot of you're such good advocates. You talked about a lot of this. The benefits of a known donor are certainly, someone you've gotten to know more characteristics about them. And I would say from a medical standpoint, one of the benefits is a lot of times you can bank more sperm in one sitting, have multiple vials frozen in case you have, multiple cycles that you're undergoing, whether it be IUI or IVF versus an anonymous donor. Typically, you're purchasing those vials separately and you're kind of going through that a little bit of roller coaster. I think some people would say on the other side, a known donor, one of the downsides is there's a little bit more upfront work that has to be done, which you guys talked about. It's getting the genetic carrier screening, it's getting the infectious disease testing that is typically already done for you if you go through a anonymous donor bank, right? And so that's usually the pluses and minuses that I go through with patients, is that it might be more upfront investment for someone that's a known donor, but you do have that benefit, and obviously very important for your family, the fact that this person and you have that connection to them. And then other people would argue that anonymous route, knowing that the ease more so that the sperm or the eggs have, for the most part, already been collected and have those legal things in place and a lot of the testing that's already been done for you. So those are the things to think through. And those are the conversations that we typically have based on what someone is needing in regards to building their family. All right, next slide. And then last, is selecting a gestational carrier. And David, you talked about this, but I think a lot of people would argue this is one of the harder parts in regards to third party. All these pieces are very difficult, getting a sperm source, an egg source, but certainly a gestational carrier is a tough process. And, we certainly help a lot of patients that are working through a gestational carrier and work with multiple agencies. And it's wonderful that for your family, you were such a good advocate that you kind of went out and found someone. And it's so wonderful to hear this amazing relationship that you had with your gestational carrier. But certainly our goal is to help you and, work through that in regards to what is, an agency to work through, and recognize that these patients all have to be medically clear, just like David said. Not everyone can be a gestational carrier. The caveats, we think about what the American Society of Reproductive Medicine recommends, typically somebody should probably have had a child already to recognize that they, have the ability to go forward and have a pregnancy. They have to go through rigorous infectious disease testing, FDA questionnaires, a physical exam. They have to have their medical history reviewed. They have to be seen by a high-risk OB. There's a lot of steps here that I think people don't, talk about or think about but it's important to have these realistic, understanding in place. But certainly our goal is to try to expedite this the best we can, but be here for the emotional side of this, recognizing that there's so many starts and stops. But I'm just, we're here to help you get certainly through those pieces. So that's kind of what I would say in regards to the gestational carrier. Next slide.
So in the situation where we are using an egg from the same person that we're using the uterus, where we're using that person's egg, using that person's uterus, and the missing ingredient is the sperm. One of the options to get that person pregnant is insemination. The other name for it is Iui, Intrauterine Insemination. And what that looks like is basically what we're doing in clinic is we monitor to know when you're actually going to ovulate. Sometimes we give you medications to help you ovulate. And when we see that you're ovulating, either a natural cycle where we, we're just monitoring you and we know the timeline based on ultrasounds and lab work, we just inject the best sperm of your choosing, whether, again, that's a partner, whether that's a known donor or an anonymous donor. We inject that sperm directly into the uterus at the perfect time. And then we see whether or not you're pregnant in a couple weeks. So, whether or not this is an option for you, it would really, be dependent on whose egg you're using, whose uterus you're using. And so the other option, instead of just injecting donor sperm, known donor sperm or anonymous donor sperm into the uterus, the other option is IVF, which would be, if we go to the next slide, where we take one person's egg, fertilize it with some sperm, and take that embryo and potentially put it back into wherever we got our eggs, or we take that embryo and put it into someone else's body. So just to clarify a little bit, in order to harvest someone's eggs, we're going to go through something called an Ivf cycle, where we give you medications that you inject yourself with every single night that help to mature whatever eggs your ovaries will offer us that month. And once they mature, it takes about 10 days or so of injections to help them mature. We do a 20-minute procedure in the office while you're asleep to poke through the vagina and actually harvest each of those eggs that have matured over a good 10 days. And once we harvest them from your body, we can freeze them, and that would be just egg freezing. Or if you have a sperm source, we take those eggs we just harvested and we directly inject the best sperm into those eggs. A few days later, they become embryos. And what we do with those embryos will really depend on who is going to carry the pregnancy. So if we go to the next slide, if we're going to put that embryo into the same person whose eggs we're using, that's called autologous IVF. If we're going to take that embryo and put it into someone else's body, that's reciprocal IVF. And so if you go to the next slide, this is kind of the process. The process is we take a little needle and we that carries the sperm, and we directly inject that we directly inject the egg with that sperm. And a few days later, hopefully it becomes an embryo of about 100 cells or so. And at that point, when it becomes embryos, it has now the genetics of the sperm donor, the genetics of the egg donor, and they combine in unique ways such that each one of those embryos is going to have its own unique genetic makeup. And if they're healthy enough, we can biopsy those embryos and tell you, okay, of the 5 little embryos we have, embryo number 1 is a genetically normal girl. Embryo number 2 is a girl with Down syndrome. Embryo number 3 is a genetically normal boy. Embryo number 4 is a girl with cystic fibrosis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can actually pick which embryo, which sex, which, do you only want genetically normal? Do you only want girls? You can actually pick what kind of embryo you want inserted into the uterus to get you pregnant.
I think we're kind of wrapping up in regards to what the plan is, which I'm certainly looking forward to the questions. It looks like some people have already sent in some, so it's great. I think for us and, you know, what we're hearing from the stories, that I think a lot of the general takeaways is that there's a lot of options, and it's just very individualized based on what your family building needs are. And it comes down to, you know, when you're coming in as a couple or a single parent, you know, what are we needing in order to make these building blocks that are going to help you have a baby? And it may require egg donation. It may require sperm donation. It can be actually embryo donation. So some people decide they want to go forward and actually adopt an embryo. And that's where the sperm and the egg have already come together, made an embryo, and someone's decided, I think I want to go ahead and adopt an embryo that's already developed. For someone, maybe that means they need a gestational carrier. And then we know there's options too, that maybe this isn't the path for everyone, and there's the option to do traditional adoption. So this is a very individualized journey for everyone. And I think that it's just important to understand that not one story is the same as somebody else, but we recognize that even though it's complicated, we certainly want to be here to be an advocate to make sure that it's the right journey for you. Next slide. So in regards to kind of next steps, you know, for anyone that's on here that has, you know, wanting to tune in, they're starting the process and thinking about what's the family building going to look like for them, or someone that's already kind of been down the path, and certainly we've already talked about the frustrations that go along with this, and maybe they need some new information or new insight and just a fresh look, a fresh, you know, outlook on things. Definitely, we want to emphasize the importance of knowledge, and I think I said this earlier, that I think it's so great that you all, you know, the panelists on here are just such good advocates, and they're wanting to help other patients, but they've been such good advocates for their own care too. And at Kindbody, that's certainly something that we relish in, because it's going to make sure that you get the best care. So I think the general takeaway is you want to empower yourself and, you know what your options are, and that's what's going to make for the best care that's individualized for you. Next slide. So in regards to, you know, next steps, we've talked about the fact that we've expanded drastically in like the last couple months, and we have clinics across the United States. So, you know, if you're anywhere close to these locations, that might be the home base for you. But, you know, David already mentioned that, you know, they didn't necessarily live that close to, you know, Vios, our St. Louis region, and it worked out because the gestational carrier was closer. So it's not that you necessarily have to be next to these locations to come and see us. And I think what, at least one thing that COVID has done for us is allowed for telemedicine to be every day a part of our life, which then allows us to be able to take care of anyone across the United States or even international. So I think, you know, take a look here, but even if we're not anywhere in your region, it still makes sense to reach out, because we do telemedicine every day. That's how I see a lot of my patients, especially for new patient visits. So it doesn't mean that just because you're not located near us, that this wouldn't be the right place for you. Next slide. And then we also wanted to say that for anyone tuning in, definitely to, you know, make it a little bit, although we've already talked about the expenses, you say $100 probably means nothing to the panelists on here, but I think it's just one thing to think about, that if you wanted to go forward and at least make that first kind of step to have a consult, they would definitely honor $100 off that first visit. But I think there's certainly a lot of work that needs to be done from the financial piece. David hit on that a little bit. And I think, you know, this week has been helpful, National Infertility Awareness Week, to help with the advocacy in regards to legislation and the importance of moving these things forward from a financial piece. And I think we all just have to keep working on that, and just know that we recognize that that is a barrier, and it's a tough thing for all of us. Next slide. So I definitely wanted to open up the floor for question and answer.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Purdy and Dr. Pedroso, for sharing your expertise. And thank you to David, Langley, and Laura for being so willing to share your family building journeys. Raising awareness and empowering others is so important, and we are so appreciative of this conversation and the fact that you could all join us today. We've gotten some great questions in the chat, so let's start off with this one. Can you talk about the 6-month quarantine of the sperm when using a known donor? Is it always required?
Yeah, I can hit on that. So that's one of the big differences between anonymous and known donors. So the donor, the process of being a donor is regulated by the FDA, regardless if it's eggs, it's sperm, gestational carrier. Things are regulated by the FDA in regards to infectious disease testing. And so the FDA mandates that if you're using an anonymous donor, that the sperm does need to be quarantined for 6 months after infectious disease testing has come back negative. That is not necessarily the case for a known donor. So for a known donor, there does not have to be the 6-month quarantine. And it's really clinic dependent in regards to if that clinic mandates that. So the FDA does not require that. The American Society of Reproductive Medicine does recommend strongly to quarantine known donor sperm for that 6-month timeline, but it is not a mandate. So I will say, at our clinics, we typically go through the risks of moving forward with using a known donor without doing the quarantine, but you would still go through the same rigorous infectious disease testing up front to make sure that those all came back negative. And in regards to that, even though it's a little bit clinic specific, I will say that we have traditionally allowed for patients to go forward using a known donor without doing that 6-month quarantine. And maybe Langley and Laura can speak into that. I don't know if they had you guys do the 6-month quarantine or not.
Yeah, I mean, I love to hear it's clinic dependent. That was one reason why we were really motivated to work with Kindbody. I mean, one, the offices are beautiful and it's fun. I knew all the people in those pictures. We were really early patients of you guys when it almost sounded too good to be true. So we were a little skeptical about like the medicine. And so I was like, I'm going to go check this out because this sounds like the best route. And it was the quickest and so responsive. And thank goodness I'm married to a veterinarian that helped me do all the shots, but it's really overwhelming. You're like, it's this like perfect science and you're trying to draw the medicine and I hate needles. And so there's always someone I could reach out to in the WhatsApp group. And I loved the level of care. And then the Kindbody was great with the known donor. They were like, you guys are adults. We signed a lot of legal documents before. We had done so much talking and kind of intentional planning. And then
that was one of the main reasons also that, again, we went to Kindbody because the communication about the legal aspects of everything was so in our timeline that we were looking for. And some of the other clinics were not.
Yeah. So we were like, it's an easy answer, Kindbody.
That's so good to hear. And we want to be, efficient. And that's a really big goal because there's so much starting and stopping, but we obviously want to, go by what is important from a medical standpoint. And I think the general takeaway is, once again, if it's a known donor, you're still going through the rigorous testing that an anonymous donor is going through. You're not cutting corners by any means. It's just saying at this point, if this infectious disease come back negative, then there's not that stipulation to have to quarantine, which I think is very reasonable and a very important counseling tool to make sure that everybody's on board with that. But long story short, it is clinic dependent, but I will say, yeah, Kindbody, we do not require that 6-month quarantine.
Great, thank you. We have another question here. Does the second parent have to legally adopt the child if they are not the biological parent, or can their name be on the birth certificate? Do you have to be married to have both names on the birth certificate?
I don't know, Laura and Langley, do you guys want to speak to this a little bit more? The legal side of that, you probably might have a little bit more experience with it, having gone through it yourself.
Yeah, it's a great question. I do not know the piece about if you are not married. I do know for sure if you are married and both your names are on the birth certificate, you do not have to adopt the child. We just went through the extra step. Her stepdad's a lawyer, and we have a lot of friends that, we're so lucky to be in an era where we can legally be married and have rights. And it is a really great time to be gay, right? And a lot of my friends that have children were not so lucky. So they were all very adamant about the second parent adoption. So that was kind of my guiding light, was the generation before. But now, yeah, it's phenomenal. If you're married and you have a baby, you're covered. You don't have to do that.
And I'd love to hear also, David, did you have the same experience?
Yeah, we did have the same experience with regards to the birth certificate. I will say, it's a little disheartening still, some of the language that's used on birth certificates. I am listed as mother/parent one on the birth certificate. Our daughter was born in Missouri. But I know there are changes being made to that. So we are hopeful for a day when, that's not the case. But yes, I mean, to your point, to both of your points, it was relatively simple. There was obviously a whole host of paperwork to have to go through, but as a lot of people have alluded to, I know this isn't a legal conversation, but a lot of people have alluded to already that when we go through this process, the legal part is sort of like a requirement, right? So we're working with people who know more than we do and who are advocating for all sides and who essentially make that process as simple as it can be, although it is still very complicated. So all that to say is, make sure that you're finding people who you're working with across the board, not just, we're talking tonight about medical, but legal and otherwise, that are people that you really trust and you feel like are reputable, because you're going to need their help a lot when it comes to questions like this. So, but all that to say is, yes, I mean, it was relatively simple for the most part, just a lot of things to sign.
Thank you. And we're almost at time here, but we're going to take a couple more questions. I've heard that a therapist appointment is required as a part of this process. Why is that?
So I can touch on that. I would say more mental, more of a counselor. So this goes back to what the American Society of Reproductive Medicine recommends in regards to having this outlet for someone who's building a family who may need to use a donor source. To be able to go through, and it's not necessarily a psychologist or to be able to screen anyone to say that someone's appropriate to be a parent, because that's not at all what that should be. The typical recommendation from that counselor is to say, ask the questions of, what's your plan, later, to talk about how your family was built, and to go through and say, okay, questions are brought up in regards to, how does this come together? How did our family come together? It's to kind of troubleshoot those questions together, just to make sure that everybody feels comfortable moving forward. But I certainly, I agree. I feel like, some people would say it's a little bit of a double standard, because it says, okay, well, just because we have to build our family a little bit differently, why do I have to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist? But I certainly would never think of it like that. It's more from the recommendation from that American Society of Reproductive Medicine to say, you want to have an outlet to be able to ask someone who's a professional in regards to having the tools to talk to, a child down the road. And I think that it's just to be able to have that person who's an expert in regards to maybe fielding those questions. But that is a tough one. And that does come up a lot, because it does seem a little bit sometimes like a double standard. And I get that question a lot. But my, general thought and general takeaway is to say, it's really that outlet. And a lot of patients, and I, maybe Langley and Laura and David can speak to this, that, are say, gosh, it was a beneficial conversation to have to talk through these questions. But I certainly, I'd like to hear what you guys thought in regards to, talking through a counselor going through this. David, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I agree it is a double standard. 1,000%. And if you're on this call as someone who identifies as LGBTQ, I hate to tell you, but you probably know there's going to be a lot of those in this process. Sadly, it's getting better, but there's still a lot. But that said, of all the double standards that we encountered, to me, this was like one of the ones that bothered me the least, because I feel like if there is, I feel like it makes sense that, I think everybody should have to have some sort of conversation, right, before becoming a parent, because it's a lot. And just for somebody to be able to bounce something off of, especially a professional, before you dive into this huge life choice, is just really beneficial. So while I understand that it is a double standard, 100%, of all of the double standards that exist, I am, this one bothers me the least. And especially when we were working with our gestational carrier, who at the time was a complete stranger to us, it's just nice to know, like, somebody else has vetted them and thinks that they're not just medically competent, but also mentally competent, because it's a lot.
Great, thank you. And one last question. How do you or can you influence how a gestational carrier acts during the pregnancy, like standard appointments and lifestyle decisions?
David, I don't know if you want to take this.
Yeah, really, it all comes down to legal. I think it helps if you have a relationship, or if you can build a relationship. Again, we were so fortunate, although our GC was someone who we didn't know, we were able to build a relationship with her, and she had done this before, so she was far more knowledgeable than we were. but it kind of, all of that sort of gets ironed out in the legal paperwork. This document that y'all have to sign is like hugely thick, but that's the reason why, is because you sort of outline all of those things in that document to make sure you're all on the same page. So if it's not a situation where you're comfortable and or where you can't sort of ask those things ahead of time and talk about those things ahead of time, that's kind of what the attorneys are for, and also what the documentation is for, is to make sure that have really been no stones left unturned in terms of being on the same page about lifestyles decisions, or even medical decisions. Kind of it's all sort of laid out there and everybody signs it. So it's really helpful if you're able to have a conversation ahead of time. I know it can be awkward and it might be sort of weird, but we were able to sort of hash all of that out personally before we got to lawyers. And so by the time we got to the lawyers, that process was actually pretty easy, because we knew what we wanted, she knew what she wanted, and we fortunately we're pretty aligned. So
Great, thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight for such an important conversation. Thank you to Dr. Pedroso and Dr. Purdy and David and Langley and Laura. We really appreciate your insight, and we appreciate you for sharing your stories. If you have any questions, please DM us at Vios Fertility or at Kindbody. You can also visit viosfertility.com or kindbody.com to learn more or book a consultation. Thank you for joining us, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you all so much for being on here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, everyone.